listening to The Big Picture. The Big Picture. Here is SiriusXM's chief Washington correspondent, Olivier Knox.
Welcome back to The Big Picture. I'm Olivier Knox, chief DC correspondent for SiriusXM. This is your regular reminder. I cover the White House, domestic policy, foreign policy, and strange little corners of the federal bureaucracy. One thing I'm watching here from the SiriusXM perch in DC is fighting between Palestinians and Israel. It's been the worst outbreak of violence since the two sides fought a 50-day war in the summer of 2014. There appears to be, at least for the moment, an Egyptian-brokered ceasefire. Here to discuss what is happening in the Middle East is Noura Erakat, human rights attorney, assistant professor at George Mason University, and editorial board member of the Journal of Palestine Studies. You can find her on Twitter at 4Noura, the number 4, Noura. Noura, welcome back. How are you?
I'm great. How are you?
Oh, it's been a week. It's been a long week. So tell me what we're seeing in the Middle East in this latest conflict.
Well, I think what listeners need to understand, and just a little bit to amend what you were saying, that this is the worst form of fighting. But what gets lost in this is that when we're only looking at when Israel and Hamas, the elected Palestinian political group that governs the Gaza Strip, are engaged in some sort of a fire exchange, is that in the absence of that exchange, the Palestinians, about 2 million Palestinians who are living in the Gaza Strip, are subject to structural violence every single day, even in the absence of some, spectacular air power and rocket fire, right? So those Palestinians that are living there have been subject to an 11-year siege that the World Health Organization says is already worse than a crisis. It is a catastrophe. There is no access to hygienic water because the only electricity generator Israel shot out in the war in 2014. Schools are now even less staffed because the U.S. is cutting aid to the United Nations relief works agencies. Palestinians are being kept on a 2,000 calorie a day diet because the Israeli military and political wings are keeping them just above the level of starvation. So even when we're not looking, those Palestinians, 2 million Palestinians, human beings, are being subject to horrific violence. And then, this is not the worst outbreak of violence since 2014. In May 2018 of this year, as Palestinians who are protesting their dehumanizing conditions, 45,000 Palestinians are protesting on their own land, demanding that the siege be ended, demanding that their rights as refugees be honored, were shot dead by Israeli snipers, killing 65 unarmed Palestinians who are on their own land, where Hamas was nowhere to be seen, where there was no rocket fire. If we do not expand our analysis to understand that the situation in the Gaza Strip is a human rights catastrophe, where Israel has placed the population under collective punishment in what is now a 70-year struggle to erase a native population in order to make way for a settler population in their place, we are going to misunderstand the point. This is not about Hamas and Israel. This is about a people struggling to exist, struggling for their human rights, struggling for basic goods. And so, yes, this is really awful what's happening right now, and it does complicate a political situation. But even if we stem the rocket fire and Israel's military attacks, which looks like it's on the horizon, it's really not going to solve this problem, which is why we have seen what looks like an eruption in violence every few months to every few years.
I'm talking to Noura Erakat, human rights attorney, editorial board member of the Journal of Palestine Studies, assistant professor at George Mason University. I don't follow the Middle East as closely as I used to. I used to have to track it much more closely when I was at AFP, the French news agency. But I came across this one paragraph in the Washington Post that I thought was worth looking at. Before the latest flare-up, the two sides have been close to such a deal referring to a long-term agreement between Israel and Hamas. It would have entailed economic aid for Gaza, including a cash injection in international reconstruction projects in return for Hamas clamping down on border demonstrations and preventing the use of incendiary kites that have been launched across the border fence into Israel. I wasn't aware that there was even this kind of negotiation going on.
Yes, there have been negotiations. And so the other thing that's also missed is that Hamas is actually a very reasonable broker and has done a lot to contain other attacks from the Gaza Strip. There are groups that think that Hamas is too soft on Israel within the Gaza Strip because of the horrific conditions that the Palestinians have been placed under. And so Israel actually wants to make sure that Hamas continues to exist and to continue to exert its policing, some sort of police authority in order to stem these attacks. Which is why we need to also be wary that, Israel doesn't want to negotiate with Hamas. They negotiate with Hamas all the time. They've negotiated a 2012 ceasefire. They negotiated the 2014 ceasefire. They're negotiating right now on a 3-step process that seeks to both, stem the Palestinian popular protest, that seeks to, ease the siege but not end the siege, that seeks to, end the, that also seeks to, for example, just have some long-term quiet and enact some sort of reconciliation between Hamas and Fatah in the West Bank. So there is an ongoing negotiation, but these negotiations aren't getting at the root problem. They're basically going to make the lives of Palestinians a little bit more livable. But I want us to question the logic of what Israel is doing in order to advance its political goals. It is using 2 million Palestinians in the Gaza Strip as negotiating chips. They are weaponizing an entire people. They are securitizing them. They are denying them their civilian status, even in warfare, so that in the Israeli Supreme Court decision in May 24th, 2018, after Israel shot dead 65 unarmed Palestinians, which is a massacre, which Palestinians are referring to as their South Africa moment, right? Is that we are not paying attention. We are not paying attention to the fact that the Israeli Supreme Court has defined even Palestinian popular protest as a Hamas ploy. So that no matter what Palestinians do to be able to live and to thrive is being turned into a security threat if they protest, if they dance, if they produce theater, if they produce poetry, right? All of these things are being deemed a security threat. And yet what we remain mainly concerned about is, Hamas's rhetoric Israel's rhetoric that Hamas is an existential threat to this. This is what's really scary about this. And it's really especially scary, and I think for Americans, it makes a little bit more sense now that we live in an administration where facts don't matter and up is down and war is peace, that, maybe now, because we're living through a Trump administration, we have a little bit more consciousness to understand what Israel is doing, how it doctors images, how it creates propaganda for us to accept such large-scale civilian suffering of an entire people over decades.
Talking to Noura Erakat, human rights attorney, editorial board member of the Journal of Palestine Studies, and an assistant professor at George Mason University. Noura, what do you teach at George Mason, just out of curiosity?
Legal studies, international area studies, and social justice and human rights.
All right. Noura is on Twitter at 4, the number 4, Noura. Noura, we've been promised a U.S. Middle East peace plan now for months and months and months, and it doesn't seem like one's on the horizon. The Trump administration has reoriented its Middle East policy away from trying to find a two-state solution and towards containing Iran. What does this all mean for the Palestinians?
It means that, there has been no U.S. administration that has advanced the Palestinian goal of some sort of freedom. And for many, many decades, all Palestinians have asked for is sovereignty, a state. So when we say two-state solution, it's actually basically a negotiated solution for a Palestinian state because Israel has existed as a state since 1948. It's the Palestinians that don't have one. And Israel doesn't want the Palestinians to have one because it wants the lands that they're on, the West Bank, and it also wants the coastline of the Gaza Strip, and it wants all of Jerusalem. So that's why we haven't seen the quote-unquote two-state solution. Israel has torpedoed the possibility of a Palestinian state because it wants to consolidate its control, and there's no accountability because every U.S. administration has both pumped unequivocal aid into Israel. The Obama administration increased an aid package of $3 billion a year to $3.8 billion a year. So what now the Trump administration is doing is basically saying, look, we've been talking out of both sides of our mouth for nearly 5 decades, where we've promised to see a Palestinian state, but simultaneously done nothing to hold Israel to account and enabled it to continue to expand its colonial takings, what the Trump administration did was say, no more doublespeak. The United States is going to be honest. We just want to support Israel's goals. There will be no Palestinian state. And so the Trump administration has taken Jerusalem off the table, has ended $364 million of funding for refugees in the United Nations Relief Works Agency, has ended $200 million of funding to U.S. aid projects in the West Bank, and now is planning a deal of the century where they consolidate all of their takings, where even the settlements that are illegal under international law are being accepted as Jewish neighborhoods that are not subject to negotiation, and where the Gaza Strip under the Trump, we only see leaks versions of this. We haven't seen the actual document, but what we understand is that the Gaza Strip will come under become a free trade zone under Egyptian administration. I mean, that is bye-bye to any notion of a Palestinian state at all. Israel still gets to keep its state and gets to keep much greater holdings. And Palestinians basically live as a dispersed population without national sovereignty and without any fulfillment of self-determination as they've been fighting for since 1917.
Noura, I'm so old, I remember when the Saudis had their own version of Middle East peace. It doesn't seem like the Arab governments in the area are as engaged as they used to be in the Middle East peace process. Saudi certainly looks like it's aligned itself with the United States now in sort of making Iran the central focus of foreign policy. Are the Palestinians' Arab neighbors letting them down?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. In terms of Saudi Arabia, I think what you're referring to is the 2002 Arab Peace Initiative. And
That's right.
This is really instructive. Because in 2002, the Saudi government presented a peace plan on behalf of 22 Arab states and the Palestinians to Israel and said, we will normalize relationships with Israel. You will become a neighbor in the Middle East rather than a colonial power. As long as you allow Palestinians to have a state, establish a state on 22% of Mandate Palestine in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. I mean, they basically offered everything. But Israel, because it doesn't need a negotiated solution, it can have more than that because it benefits from U.S. aid, financial, diplomatic, military, doesn't even need a solution with the Palestinians. They can take their time to establish the facts on the ground to make a new reality basically according to its dictates. But what you're saying is right. Since that time, even that kind of Arab support of the Palestinian cause has dramatically shifted. It's shifted in the way that the Arab uprisings have reconfigured the Middle East, the way that the Bush administration's war on Iraq has reconfigured the Middle East. What's happening in the Syrian civil war has basically created new alliances where we see Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Jordan, the United Arab Emirates, frankly, in much closer alliance with Israel than we see them in some sort of pan-Arab or pan-Islamic alliance with the Palestinians. And the Mohammed bin Salman, king of Saudi Arabia, has told Palestinians outright that they need to accept whatever the U.S. is offering and stop complaining. I mean, talk about a lack of support and a shift in the way that we're thinking about this. But yes, this reconfiguration for many of these Arab states has made it much more important to establish hegemony in the Middle East, which means that, it's at odds with Iran more than it's at odds with Israel, which has diminished their support of the Palestinian cause for self-determination.
Noura, why are the Egyptians the ones broken the ceasefire? Is it just the geographic proximity?
Well, it's a historic reason, of course, but it's also the fact that the Sisi government, in one, has interest in the Gaza Strip, in the fact that for it, it's also a security concern. It sees that the Sinai Peninsula at the south of the Gaza Strip is a place of unpoliced land, and so there have been a number of even Egyptian operations that have taken place there outside of the bounds of the state. So it becomes a security threat in that way. But also for the Sisi regime, it wants to see Hamas's power diminished, because Hamas is an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood, which within Egypt has become enemy number one. Especially we see most pronounced when the Sisi regime, as general of the Egyptian forces, stages a coup to oust the Muslim Brotherhood, which had come into power through democratic elections. And so now for Egypt, they have, a shared enemy in Hamas with Israel. They're less concerned with it, and they are able to negotiate these ceasefires by placing, by both appearing to Israel as sharing a shared animosity of Hamas, but also by appearing to Hamas as being, frankly, the only broker that is going to have any kind of influence, especially because Egypt controls one of the 5 points of entry and exit surrounding the Gaza Strip.
All right, Noura Erakat, a human rights attorney, assistant professor at George Mason University, and an editorial board member of the Journal of Palestine Studies. Noura, it's always a pleasure to have you on the show.